Welcome in, everybody, to the best in paranormal podcasting. This is Darkness Radio. I'm your host, Tim Dennis. I'm excited about today's show, and I'll tell you why. You know, we're in the middle of summer. We're at the midpoint of summer. 4th of July is now past, the Independence Day for America. I have a English writer, a British writer, on today's show, and multimedia artist. We're going to talk a little bit today about trips. You know, summer vacations are at the midpoint for us Americans. And I'll tell you, our audience is a little bit different. Our audience is at a point where, you know, you can take the traditional trip. You can go to the cabin. You can go to the lake. You can even go to the ocean. You could take your typical water trip if you want. Our audience is different in that we can take a paranormal trip. You can go ghost hunting. You can see an asylum. You could take an organized trip, or maybe you can go off on your own and do a haunted trip. I have a little bit different idea for you. My guest today is Andy Sharp. Andy has a brand new book out there called The Astral Geographic. Now, this trip can be a metaphorical one by reading this book. By the way, this book comes out in October 10th to be exact. Pre-orders are available right now. We have a link in the description of this program. This could be a metaphorical trip. And it's a metaphorical magic or occult trip in which you can find out the different geographical areas where the occult formed or started. And you can take that trip in your mind. Or quite literally, Andy has made this easy for you in that he gives you locations where you can go, where you can stay, where you can eat. And this is interesting in that it's kind of like a Watkins guide to the occult world. He's actually set this up for you quite nicely. We'll talk a little bit about the Astral Geographic in today's program. So interesting stuff. We'll get down to it today in the program with Andy Sharp. He's a writer and multimedia artist, as I said. Since 2003, he has worked on English Heretic, which is an autonomous creative research project that culminated in the publication of his critically acclaimed first book, The English Heretic Collection. Andy has talked at academic conferences and countercultural events on a wide range of subjects drawn from its research. He has an MSc in neuroscience from King's College. I want to welcome to the Darkness on the Edge of Town paranormal radio show, Andy Sharp. Hi, Andy. How you doing?
Great, thanks. Yeah, good to be on it. Yeah. Thank you for the introduction. That sums up very much what I'm about and what the book's about. Yeah, so that's good.
Well, I appreciate you being on today, and I had a chance to kind of survey the book a little bit, and I'm impressed with how you've put this together. And you know, I want to talk a little bit first about trepidation, because I do have a section of my audience, and I'm just, you know, kind of truth in advertising here. I do have a section of my audience that might be a little trepidatious about picking up a book that would deal with the darker side of the occult, maybe even Satanism at times. And again, truth in advertising, there is a little bit of this book that does deal with Satanism right off the bat. I mean, we start off the book right off the bat with Satanism and the origins of Satanism. But I'll tell you this, the reason why I'm never afraid to tackle this subject or the darker side of the occult is I believe in a well-rounded education in all sides of the supernatural, the paranormal. And that is because if you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going, so to speak. Address with me, if you will, I guess you could say the inspiration for the book and what you were trying to do with this book and writing the book in its origins and including places, and what was your thinking in putting this book together?
Okay, yeah. So I've written a lot about counterculture and geography and what we call, I think in the UK is known as occulture, the culture of the occult. Okay. You know, so if you think about things like, it's not necessarily the practice of magic, but it's the kind of things associated with it. So a good example might be the films of Kenneth Anger or something like that, you know.
Sure.
So where it touches, you know, the Rolling Stones, you know, when they got involved and all that kind of stuff, you know, where it feeds into, so culture is a kind of pop culture and magic and things like that. So I've written about that for for a long time, and I've had a personal interest in esotericism for many years. Looking at about probably 35 years. The idea of the book was to tell the story of various strains of what you call magical practice by their connection with geography. Okay. Throughout the book, I'm looking at places where I can tell a particular evolution of a particular type of magic or practice, but intimately tied in with buildings, locations of deposits of archaeological goods that related to a particular practice, so you could tell the story. Houses that are maybe being, nexuses for particular groups and things like that. So it's a strong. So nailing down, I want to tell the story of magic, and it's a wide story, and I want to tell discrete forms of practice. And I thought, well, let's do this through geography, but we do it two ways. So we can either look at a practice, or we can look at a geography and its relation to magic. So the book is split. It's sort of half and half, 10 chapters. So there'll be chapters on how do I tell the story of witchcraft, how do I tell the story of the Indian practice of tantra. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is like how have gardens been used in a magical context? Okay. How have deserts been used in a magical context? What's the magic that comes out of a desert? So I split it in two ways. There's half and half. How to tell the story of Atlantis, through various eruptions of the myth. So it's split half and half. It's not a hard thing, but I just to give it a bit of variety. So as you say, it is a travel guide, and I've visited a lot of the places over 20 years. So I've brought in places I visited, did specific over the last four years, quite a lot of traveling in order to get to actually physically visit these venues. And as you say, there's elements, there's maps in it, and there's postcards, and there's also sort of on-point places to stay, so symbolic hotels that might aid in terms of creating the atmosphere you visit. So I don't just say, if you're off that place where, I don't know, there was visit the Hilton Hotel, all the hotels, right. All the places to stay, places to eat are kind of symbolic events. So in other words, you can make it into this kind of symbolic adventure, really. The idea is that everything there's meaning in everything. These are dots that are connected. So I hope that so each of the chapters are split up into an itinerary. So there'll be a map, and there'll be a physical itinerary of places to explore, and I pick out the key points, and then in an essay part, I pull out, like an archaeologist, this thing we found here, how does this explain this magical practice? So it's got a very fixed structure and a strong. So travel guides, typically you would like, if you're thinking about one Lonely Planet or whatever the ones you have in the States, rough guides we have in here, you wouldn't. You wouldn't have it. It's not a themed holiday in there, but this is themed holidays. Think about that. So sure. The concept, but the theme carries throughout chapter into a deeper discussion. So
to give people an idea, I'll go right back to the theme we started off with, talking about Satanism and talking about just the darker part of the occult. You do a wonderful job in the first part of the first route in the book. You go by routes, and the first route is Satan's places, and you talk about different areas in Europe and even going to Tunisia and Egypt. And you put out a map of different places that are basically the birthplaces of these darker places of the occult. One of the places you mentioned is the Hellfire Club, both in England and in Ireland. And it's not just a place that was mentioned in Stranger Things, folks. And although there are a lot of T-shirts that were sold, the Hellfire Club wasn't just something on Stranger Things. One of the things I liked about it is you mentioned George and Vulture in London.
Oh, yeah.
And then you also recommended it as a place to eat.
It is, yeah. And it was the first meeting place. Most people associate Sir Francis Dashwood's Hellfire Club with West Wickham, which is west of London, where there is like a showcase down there and you can visit there. But I kind of just wanted to avoid that because I wanted to do something. Everybody knows about the Hellfire Caves, and I think it's great, but I wanted to do a slightly different angle. So in actual fact, the George and Vulture is where they first met. Mm-hmm. So Sir Francis Dashwood's Hellfire Club then moved to West Wickham. I thought, let's find out where they first met. And it is an eatery, and there's a kind of a whole strange kind of dark mythology about them having to roast a servant and things like that. So and this kind of like legend sort of then migrates to the Irish Hellfire Clubs that have a similar story and things like that. So in the book, I'm in a lot of places, and I'm looking at the way that the myth migrates. So in the chapter on Satanism, I start off in a place called Mendes, which is where this Egyptian society venerated the ram, and it birthed the idea of the goat of Mendes. So the goat of Mendes that became the Baphomet of the Templars, derives from Egypt. So I'm looking at that, that image, the image that we all know from, The Devil Rides Out and all these films and heavy metal album covers, and looking at the kind of roots of it in Egyptian mythology and things like that. So this is where as I say, what I'm kind of doing is going to each of these places and then excavating symbols, the symbol of the goat of Mendes, and see how that then travels through Europe and into kind of California, where Anton LaVey sort of had his Church of Satan in the 60s. So in the end, I go to California and look at Anton LaVey's Black House and an amazing house called William Westerfield House.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit about the Westerfield House. I find it interesting the compare and contrast between Anton LaVey's Black House and the Westerfield House. You describe the Black House at the end as it begins to break down a little bit as kind of a bit of a shack, and then compared to
always was, basically.
Right.
So LaVey, I think, I kind of look at, I am looking at Satan, but I'm looking at it with a skeptical eye, and I think, because obviously there's bits of magic and occultism I'm very interested in and have a huge amount of respect for instance, Tantra and some of the kind of vulva witchcraft and things like that. And other things I treat, as why would you want to do that in particular, but LaVey is an interesting character because, when I was growing up, he was seen as this kind of very, very mysterious person, but actually, in fact, when I started digging into his this famous black house that he had painted black, I just realized it was just like a shotgun shack that he painted black and managed to take all the photos from a really low angle, so it looks really massive and things like that. And what's interesting is that it was subsequently demolished after LaVey died, and they have taken the address off the map in San Francisco because it's now this place that we don't want to speak about. But I was looking at contrasting this kind of little pokey shack that Anton LaVey had with this William Westerfield house, which is actually an amazing house. It looks like something from the Addams Family. Really beautiful, sort of Victorian Gothic. I love the American Victorian Gothic is incredible.
Yeah.
And the colours that they paint it with and these kind of turrets and things like that. It's absolutely beautiful building that was designed in the late 1900s. But interesting enough, LaVey liked to hang out there more than his place because it was like a lot cooler, you know. And, apparently, you can see the scratches of his lion that he used to have on the skirting boards at this place. But it was a very interesting melting point, William Westerfield House. So in the early part of the, it was kind of I think it was a nightclub there, and Russian emigres owned it for a while, and then in the 60s, Kenneth Anger, who was a filmmaker, magical filmmaker involved with the Rolling Stones, he lived there with a guy called Bobby Beausoleil, who ended up with the Mansons, and Manson visited this place. So this is a kind of real, I felt was like a real kind of powerful hub.
Like a center, yeah,
and a kind of melting pot for this kind of like quite, dramatic time, and I kind of think the kind of, if you think about the late 60s in California, it is kind of biblical. And I look in this particular chapter, what's interesting in this book is that although it's a book about occultism, a lot of the mythology comes from biblical sources, from classical Greek sources and things like that. And the more you dig into occultism, the more you find that it isn't a thing in itself. It is intimately tied in with various mythologies that we see again and again. Comparative religion. I've always been interested really in magic as a form of comparative religion, really, rather than this uniquely powerful thing that exists and is real. It's intimately tied in with religion. But I always thought, I think when I look at in the chapter on William Westerfield House and Satanism, it's a classical case of like the Garden of Eden being kind of corrupted by this serpent, with like Manson in the 60s. When you look at it in that stark terms, you can see this kind of mythic play being played out there. That we had this summer of love, and then suddenly this serpent comes in with this forbidden fruit of LSD, and then there's this kind of interesting sort of that's parables that come out of that.
That's a very interesting analogy, a very interesting way you put that, because it is when Manson comes in that everything, the worm begins to turn, so to speak. That innocence is lost. And you bring up another interesting point, too, with Kenneth Anger. There's also that, is it Altamont, where the
absolutely,
where you've got the Rolling Stones playing and the Hells Angels providing security. There's the stabbing there at Altamont. That began a whole nother deal as well.
Anger, maintains that he cursed the Stones, didn't he? And that this was a result of this curse. And then the really interesting thing about William Westerfield House is that Anger filmed inauguration of My Demon Brother there, which is kind of his I think is his most magical kind of like playing with magic in film. And there's some interesting cut-ins in that film. So there's ceremonies that are taking place in William Westerfield House, and you see Anton LaVey coming out with a skull and doing this kind of fake voodoo stuff, and later you see this ceremony downstairs with Bobby Beausoleil. But both scenes cut to the scenes cut then to the Rolling Stones, and I think that's interesting. Is he cutting up reality here in a Burroughsian sense and creating this curse through this film and things like that, inadvertently or not so inadvertently? So that's why this place is such a powerful, place to think about these things. To think about.
Let me ask you a question, Andy. Do you feel like So many years later, in the year 2023, even though we can say LaVey's shack, if you will, the Black Shack, if you want to put it that way, or even the Westerfield house, do you feel that those houses maintain that energy, or does it dissipate to the wind even so many years later?
I tend to think that, these things maintain it. I absolutely do. I do think that there's if you think about it, we project our fears into reality, and a place that has things going on and activity that's consciously trying to stir up feelings or it is going to be a magnet for it, and I think I always think there's a British occultist artist called Austin Spare who kind of said life is haunted, and I think that's my feeling about it, is that if you feel life in a certain way, then there isn't really a split between the paranormal and the non-paranormal. I think it's a continuum, and it's a way of thinking. So increasingly towards the end of the book, I started thinking about magical consciousness, and there's a very good book called Magical Consciousness by Susan Greenwood, who's an anthropologist, and it argues a case for a different way of experiencing consciousness through associative thinking rather than logical thinking, and that's essentially the difference between magical thinking and kind of reductive scientific thinking. It's a different mode of experiencing reality. And so her argument, and I agree, is that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So once you sort of accept that you can switch to magical consciousness, you can decide, right, and I think this is what ritual magic is. It's about a conscious decision to say, actually, I know that reality, I know that there is such thing as logic and reductive thinking, but actually today I'm not going to do that. I'm going to experience reality in a different way. And Susan Greenwood in her book was kind of saying, well, Westerners going to kind of shamanic societies or something like that. Mm-hmm. We traditionally kind of quite patronizing in the sense that they go, well, that's magical thinking. And they go, yeah, of course we know it's magical thinking. It's just we choose to do it. They know full well about logic, and reductive thinking is, but actually we quite enjoy this mode of thinking, or we like the opportunity to do it. And there's a term called decentering. A guy called Patrick McNamara, who's a neuroscientist, talks about it and has done a fair amount of work into nightmares and things like that, and why we haven't evolved, genetically evolved from nightmares. And he argues that there's a shamanic purpose to nightmares and things like that. And he has this concept of decentering, which is essentially saying we have this kind of cognitive centers in our brain that override everything. And they're kind of a loop in the brain, but you can drugs or trance or whatever dance or ecstatic dancing are all ways of breaking that loop, and so you go into a different way of thinking and he calls that decentering. And his argument that conscious decentering, monitored and you've got guides and people to guide you through it, and then coming back is creates a stronger sense of self and sense of identity, things like that. So my argument is that life is, a place you can choose to switch off from a place being haunted, or you can choose to think, I'm going to run with this and see how this affects your reality and, mystery. You invite mystery into your life and things like that. I think this is, why people like ghost hunting, and it invites a different a level of uncertainty into reality, which I think we need.
Yeah, Very interesting. Very interesting indeed. You know, we lost Kenneth Anger recently, and it got me thinking, and I want to throw this past you, Andy, and with this question, after this question, we'll take our break. Magical thinking involves active thinking. It involves, and the active magic involves an active body, an active brain, an active spirit. What happens when the active magician passes away? Does that active magic then stop? Do you believe that magic carries on? That the work that person has done carries on? Does it have a cumulative effect, or does it stop?
I think it carries on. I think you certainly look at people like, as I mentioned, Austin Spare and his influence on a whole generation of musicians and writers and things like that. And people could, will certainly still feel a rapport with his person, more so because he died in relative obscurity. So I think he's a great case of someone who he was very interested in avatars and kind of his kind of ancestral kind of worship. And I think someone like that, because they died in obscurity, is actually more alive now than they were in reality. They were, to other than a select bunch of people. I think and that's very much promulgated not by the physical presence, but by their output. So these kind of his drawings are very uncanny and very unearthly, but he was also a very beautiful, very talented draftsman. So he was able to draw this very precise, uncanny, and I think that essence is still very, very much there with a particular, and I think with Anger it will be as well. I think as I said, you can pick apart his stuff, and Anger had I can't remember, I have to paraphrase it, but he goes, when you're living life magically, then patterns happen throughout your life, and he, and if you look at his Magic Lantern cycle, you can see patterns throughout these films, and that's to a certain degree what I was trying to do with the book was to show, create some symbols, and show how symbols can create a language, and you don't necessarily even have to kind of debunk those symbols. You can then move through the symbols. So, so alchemy, the Hermeticism, the section on alchemy I wrote was about a guy called Fulcanelli, who was an alchemist in France, kind of mysterious figure.
Let's talk about Fulcanelli after the break. Let's take our break real quick. Yeah. When we come back, we'll talk about Fulcanelli, we'll talk about alchemy, and we'll talk about his use of architecture in that. Right. And because it's very interesting, some of the architecture he uses is let's just say tied to the church, and it's very interesting in that
absolutely
in that it may surprise our audience as to what he used and how it's used, and some of the symbolism that's in some of these cathedrals that people may go, well, wait a minute. How do you get this out of that? So we'll talk about that when we come back.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great example, yeah.
Yes. Our guest is Andy Sharp. The book is available in October. You can pre-order it right now on Amazon. We actually have a link in the description of this program. The book is called The Astral Geographic, The Watkins Guide to the Occult World. Andy Sharp is our guest. He is the author and researcher on this project. So when we come back, we'll talk about Fulcanelli. We'll talk about the way he got alchemy from these different places, these different cathedrals. It's quite exciting, folks. When we come back, more on alchemy and Fulcanelli when we return on the best in paranormal podcasting. This is Darkness Radio. Welcome back to the best in paranormal podcasting. This is Darkness Radio. I am Tim Dennis, your host. Our guest is Andy Sharp. The book is the Astral Geographic, the Watkins Guide to the Occult World. And Andy is the author, and he's our guide on this, the Astral Geographic. And again, Andy, I commend you for tying these geographic places to different areas of the occult world and explaining different areas of the occult through the geographic areas, and also different areas of the occult through that. I might be mincing my words here a little bit, but also giving us areas where we can stay, places where we can eat, if we want to see these areas for ourselves, which, you know, a lot of people, sometimes they have to get on the ground, they have to see, touch, feel, experience for themselves. But even if you don't have the funds to go out there and see some of this stuff and see history for yourself, you can jump into the book. And even if you're a skeptic, you can read these stories and this history for itself. There's plenty of history in this book. It's not something where, you know, you have to buy into the story, I guess you could say. Or if it's something where you are more of an occult believer, it's something that is more of an enriching history for you. Let's talk about Fulcanelli and alchemy.
Okay. Yeah.
I found this, the way you've tied things together with Fulcanelli and alchemy, very interesting in that. And tell us why you used Fulcanelli first of all, because, you know, we were talking off air. It was very interesting why you used Fulcanelli and not another alchemist in your story. And it had to do with geography and different points in particular.
Yeah. So, I mean, Fulcanelli was around in the early part of this century. And he's a kind of mysterious figure that might be a fabrication of two other, an artist called Jean-Julien Champagne and Eugene Cancelet was an occultist. And this character, Fulcanelli, wrote a book called The Mystery of the Cathedrals and then disappeared. And there's a whole kind of mythology about his disappearance, that he was a nuclear physicist and that the alchemists had been aware of the dangers of splitting the atom, and they'd known the secret and what would happen if we split the atom. And he kind of reappears in various tellings 20 years later, and a fascinating kind of cultural character. But he I'll just go into a bit of kind of culture here. So he was a kind of what we would call a proto-situationist. So the situationists were kind of radical political movement that started in France in the early 60s, and they developed this idea called psychogeography, where you would sort of reclaim urban spaces through imaginative play with them and things like that. And in actual fact, Fulcanelli was doing this 60, 70 years earlier. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things is that Eugene Cancelet is actually a friend of one of the people who devised situationism. So there's a kind of whole link in the French culture about that. But Fulcanelli, treatise called The Mystery of Cathedrals suggests that Notre Dame Cathedral is essentially the carvings on outside the building, or a bunch of plaques outside on the arch outside the main door, were actually devised by stonemasons who are alchemists, and they were divulging the alchemical process through these sculptures or these plaques. So he looks at whatever 11, 12 of these plaques and shows the alchemical process operating through that. But as you said before the break, it goes further than that, because what essentially Fulcanelli is doing as well by looking at these cathedrals is is viewing. It's a form of Christian alchemy. So he looks at kind of the process, Christ in the manger and things like that, as alchemical metaphors. Metaphors the alchemical process. So he kind of says, actually, the Bible was really an encoded alchemical text and things like that. So,
really?
so it's absolutely fascinating. So so he goes out. So first book, or this book called Mystery of Cathedrals, centers on Notre Dame Cathedral, and he kind of explains how they were encoding a lot of kind of pagan practice in the church, hiding it, and there were a lot of pagan rituals, and this kind of whole melting pot, really. The church in the cathedral in medieval time was actually this really kind of wild melting pot, not this kind of what we perceive as a staid, conservative institution. And the second book, called The Dwelling of Philosophers, he goes to various other places, and there's this amazing place called Bourges in outside, sort of south of France, and he goes to this place, and he kind of just looks at this kitchen and goes, "Oh, this kitchen in this hotel this house is not really a kitchen; it's an alchemist laboratory." So he kind of makes all these metaphors between the cooking process, and he looks at kind of epiphany cakes and all this kind of Christian symbolism, and shows how it is what is doing, encoding the alchemical process. So it's beautiful. It's amazing. It's kind of very trippy. The guy who Fulcanelli. So one of the theories with Fulcanelli, that he was, he was hallucinating because of the amount of absinthe he drank, but in actual fact, it seems that he was actually a stoner, really. So he discusses this thing called the green language, langue verte, which is a kind of twilight language, or a language of homophones. And so within this book about Christian alchemy, there's all this incredible wordplay and punning and things like that. And there's also quite a lot of allusions that would suggest that that he was actually some of these visions and some of these ideas were coming from cannabis, using cannabis and things like that.
Really?
Fascinating guy. So it's kind of, again, he's like William Westerfield House. It's not just. It's why I'm drawn to him is he's this cultural kind of melting pot, if you like, for lots of incredibly fun ideas, really, and incredibly wild ideas, and but also on a kind of more prosaic level, you don't have to go to Notre Dame Cathedral to kind of look at your reality as a projection of a kind of hermetic process. You can go in London, certainly in England, you can walk down the street and the pub signs and things like that, and the names of places and things like that are loaded with kind of historical and toponymic meaning and things like that. And he looks at heraldry as a form of kind of alchemical language as well. So so that's my real interest in him, as he's an excellent example of someone using the geography literally as a magical tool. What you see in reality, buildings, these are all things that offer magical signposts and clues and puzzles and things like that. So that's why I chose him over, say, John Dee or as I say, talking in just before going live. I mean, most people think in Europe, the hub of alchemy would be Prague, but okay, Prague was a place where people practiced alchemy, but
right. What
I'm looking at the book is you could go to Prague and you wouldn't learn about alchemy. But what you do from visiting these places that Fulcanelli talked about, you'll actually kind of see symbols and sculptures that tell you about the alchemical process. So this is the kind of thinking of the book, is that it's always the geography that counts. It's not the place. So, for instance, like I don't talk about voodoo because I couldn't really think of a way of just looking at the geography. I'm sure someone could, but I'm always conscious of the geography in the book.
Before we get to that, I want to draw a parallel, if I can, here, Andy. When we talk about Fulcanelli, and there's some wonderful examples. Again, we want people to order that book, pre-order that book, which is coming out in October, the Astral Geographic. Fulcanelli looked at things like the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul, and saw alchemical parallels when looking at the faces of both things, symbols, and things that on the modern day level we're now seeing. Guys like Scott Walter are seeing, things like symbols like the hooked X, and seeing things like when he sees a cathedral, he sees, and you were mentioning seeing pagan things in the church that they were co-opting, I guess is a good way of putting it, co-opting and using in the Catholic religion. And Scott is now taking that stuff and putting it on television and saying, hey, listen, we've always been taking things from other religions and bringing them into ours. It's we need to start realizing that this symbolatry has always been going on. We've always been taking this stuff and bringing it in, and we've always been borrowing from one or another, and these symbols have always been here, and here's what it means.
No, I totally agree. But occultism needs to think about the fact that, by the other token, there is my argument. There isn't this pure tradition. There's nothing such a thing as an occult truth. It's this kind of bricolage. It's bits of anthropology. It's an archaeological finding. It's as you say, it's borrowing symbols. It's rereading. It's reading, the Bible in a different way. And that sort of thing is that I'm conscious in this book that I don't want. I don't want to say that there's an occult truth, because I don't think there is. There isn't, and I think there's a lot of dangers in saying that. It leads to kind of a whole bunch of problems like racial purity and stuff like that. If you start to think that there's an occult truth to reality, and so I tackle difficult areas like Atlantis, that's riddled with kind of difficulties and things like that, but always looking at the fact that it is this movement and this melting pot and this bricolage, really. And I think that's where it's inclusive, and it's also where it's enjoyable, and it's also where it's fun to do. It becomes this fun thing rather than this kind of heavy, search for power. Like the source of power, I think that's not what magic is to me. It's an enchantment of reality.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Andy. You're starting to talk about voodoo, and what was it about voodoo you wanted to bring up?
Well, I just didn't have I'm restricted by 10 chapters. There's 10 journeys in the book, so I was conscious that I was interested in voodoo, but just in my research, I couldn't think of a way of, other than saying, "Oh, let's go to New Orleans" and things like that. And I think there's problems with that anyway. There's sort of cultural tourism and things like that. So I've been conscious of not wanting the book to be about sort of cultural tourism. So so that's where I think I have a huge amount of respect for it, and I'm interested in it, but I couldn't think of a way of telling the story through geography. There's an example. I'm sure someone could.
Sure.
But there's certain, in a book of 10 chapters, there's going to be a mission of the whole story, and it's just an example. As I say, and in the case of alchemy, of not talking about Prague, where there were a lot of people practicing alchemy, because it didn't feel like you weren't telling the story through geography. You were telling the story through a place where magic took place.
Right.
So again, rather than a place that had findings, or so I look at where curses have been deposited. So that go to a place where if they found curses in a well in Cyprus or something like that. That tells you about. We learn about the place and the practice in that way. So that's a kind of slight difference.
Right. I want to swing around. You'd mentioned Atlantis, and I want to swing around to Atlantis and talk about Atlantis. You know, when we talk about Atlantis and the general, I guess you could say, location of Atlantis, and where we imagine it to be, you have a map of where you believe Atlantis is, and the different.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a map of where I think it is. I think it's a map of where the myth of Atlantis has drifted.
There you go,
so
where it's drifted.
Kind of what I'm looking at.
Okay.
So my feeling, I think my personal opinion is that it's historical. It comes from, as I said, I think so many of the sources of magic come from, classical, Greek classical thinking and things like that,
Okay.
in the Western view, not necessarily in other religions, not in Tantra, for instance. But, so you've got an island called Thera where, where basically a myth of Atlantis was written about in Greek classicism. And I think that's, it's a good argument for it. But I went and looked at a particular strain of kind of Atlantis, and that's what I call Celtic Atlantis. So the myth of the kind of interrelated myths moving from Brittany and France to Cornwall and Ireland. And if you think about it, there's a good reason for it, because those lands were joined. So, if you think about the lands splitting apart, then the mythology splits apart, but is related. So it's just an example. So I'd class it. I use, partly to avoid the kind of contentious stuff about Atlantis. The kind of the Nazis hunting for Atlantis, and I think I want to avoid that. I don't. It's. I mention it because it's it needs to be mentioned, but
sure.
I think this idea of like searching for a spiritually evolved race is not what I believe in, and I don't think that's part of the of the enchantment of reality. Is part of like saying we're a more evolved person than you, and so I deliberately concentrate on showing Atlantis as a shift in mythic drift, I call it. But there's another part to the thing where I look at various writers. So I look at Dion Fortune, who wrote a great book called Sea Priestess, and look at how she used geography to create this vision of Atlantis. And I look at a Welsh writer called Arthur Machen, who was inspired by a place, a temple to a Celtic sea god called Nodens, and that inspired some of his books. And then look at how that influenced H.P. Lovecraft's mythos. So again, I'm looking at fictional mythic drift and kind of folklore mythic drift. So that's kind of the way I've approached Atlantis. I mean, people will have a different take on it and things like that, but as I say, it's partly just to look at it with fresh eyes, reimagine it, and in a sense, in a positive light, as well.
Right.
So.
Let me ask you, Andy. I know you're dancing around the supernatural part of Atlantis a little bit here. Why is that? Why not tackle that full on?
Because the sort of visions of Edgar Cayce and things like that. Because I think that belongs to a time, but I think my problem with that is that it was sequestered by, the Nazis, really, and that sort of. And I think that we can't really, in a progressive society, we can't really go back. Madame Blavatsky's theosophy was interesting at the time, but we need to progress beyond that. Really, and I think magic needs to progress. It can't. You can't you can't just say, well, oh, just because Madame Blavatsky thought and she was a great magician, we must keep this going. There's got to be a certain critique of things that went sour, I think, to a certain degree. And I think with Atlantis, there are more positive ways of looking at it and different aspects of looking at it. And I don't critique it, but I'm sort of, the book isn't about like being overly skeptical. It's just things that are a more enchanted version of reality, rather than a kind of one that may be tainted by politics. So, yeah.
Understandably, do you think there's, and just this is just kind of the last question about Atlantis, so with that we leave a little bit of meat on the bone for the book. Do you think that there's a bit of a fallacy to anything beyond just the actual landmass of Atlantis sinking? Do you think that maybe it's blown a little out of proportion as far as Atlantis goes? As far as the technology,
a lot of my feeling is that I think that the subconscious is the best magician, and I think so I look at things like, as I mentioned, these sleep temples that were set up, and then in people's dreams, Nodens, this god of the deep, would come and heal them. And I think this is more interesting in terms of where real magic resides. It resides when things run autonomously in the subconscious mind. So throughout the book, I bring in dreams as a central point of kind of, this is where we need to look at magic, because you see this again and again in the Greek and Roman accounts of necromancy, is that basic necromancy wasn't people with a skull calling up the dead. It was ancestors coming to people in their dreams, things like that. So this idea of like dream divination and magic being practiced in dreams, I think is kind of where I'm looking at.
Okay.
So Tolkien, for instance, he was haunted by his Atlantean complex. So he was haunted by dreams of a deluge and things like that. So he ended up writing stories about it, and it turned out his son had the same dream. So I'm not looking for I don't think there's a literal truth behind that, but I think the power of subconscious to investigate dream terrains and things like that is a big part of the book. So yeah.
Okay. I think finally today, let's talk about what kind of magic you can actually have in a desert. And let's talk a little bit about Aleister Crowley to close things out today. A desert is literally and figuratively a barren place, Andy. How do you manifest magic in a desert?
Well, I think, Crowley's often, and rightly, he's seen as a showman and quite an objectionable person, but he did a particular set of workings based on some magic that was conducted by John Dee and Edward Kelly, and he took this. They're essentially calling these angelic spirits, Enochian spirits, and there are 30 of them, and you go from the 30 down to one, and they you look into a shoe stone and read these Enochian words, and then you have conversation with these angels. So Dee and Kelly had done this in I think it was in Mortlake, but Crowley was on a holiday with his at the time his lover, this guy called Victor Neuberg, and they were on a walking holiday in Algeria, and he suddenly got this vision to recommence these Enochian workings, but in the desert. He'd previously tried it in Mexico, and the visions had sort of balked, and so they walked through the desert over 3 or 4 weeks, invoking these different angels, and I think it's an amazing bit of magic that that takes one system and puts it in another place and creates something new. So he's taken this Enochian system and he's stuck it in the desert, and he's created this huge, this amazing hybrid magic. And so they famously or infamously conjured this demon called Corazon during the working of the calling of the 10th ether, and had this amazing magical battle with this demon. This particular workings had a huge cultural reach. So I look at the cultural reach of this, but also its kind of antecedents in kind of desert shapeshifters and stuff like that, like ghouls and Dijin and things like that. But the interesting thing about the formless place is that this demon was called the demon dispersion, and it kind of on the Kabbalistic tree of life, it kind of inhabits or it guards this what's called a false sephira, this sort of abyss. And in order to cross this abyss, you have to encounter Corazon and then do battle with him. But there's a whole interesting idea about this kind of this kind of like this demon being a shapeshifter and being an illusion itself, and reality being an illusion, and the perfect place for mirages and illusion where reality becomes quite elusive is a desert, because there is no form.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very, I mean, I think Crow is an intelligent guy, but I think it was just intuition that led him to do this in the desert rather than the conceptualized, but the whole kind of rationale and the kind of metaphysical sort of discussion that comes out of the whole concept of like what is a demon and what is desire and the illusory nature of all these kind of things is very, very fits very well with the desert. And obviously you've got, like I said, I look at the tradition of shape-shifting ghouls and Dijin in the desert that were there to do exactly this. Is it they would jump out on people and change form, and sometimes do this as a way of essentially driving people mad, right. And that's to do with isolation and formlessness and fear and things like that. So yeah, the desert is very, it's proven to be a very powerful place to look at the illusionary nature of reality and what is magic itself, not.
Indeed, yeah. And it was the Sahara Desert outside of Algeria, and again, the entire tale is in the book, and then there's a cult of that demon outside of Scotland. Is that the deal?
Is it Scotland, isn't it?
I think so. Because you list a place where people can actually stay. Is it Scotland? I believe it's Scotland. It is the old school house in.
Oh no, that's another chapter.
That's another chapter. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's with Wicker Man. But there was a cult.
That's regarding the Sinister Stones. I'm sorry. I'm
but you are right. There was a cult of. There was a Corazon club that was set up by Crowley and another couple of old occultists in Chicago, and I think they're still going. Yeah, there's an occultist, Michael Berthiaud, very, very interesting guy, very strange guy but the whole cult of Corazon's gone through chaos magic and things like that. But I also look at William Burroughs' City as a Red Knight and its relation to how closely it ties with some of the ideas of Crowley's desert working. So
that's crazy. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of the Castle Kennedy Gardens. Castle Kennedy Gardens.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's another chapter on megaliths. So I look at megaliths.
That's right.
Use of megaliths in fiction, and why we like to go to megaliths and think they're healing places, and why do writers find them so sinister, and fiction writers, why they always like places of bloodletting. I'm just interested in that dichotomy between our kind of like in a secular society where we see them as like nice places, whereas like Arthur Mack and Nigel Neal, all these writers, they see these places as some kind of sinister sort of folklore.
There's all kinds of interesting things in this book, Andy. I mean, there's you've dug up all these things that and I'll be honest with you, there's things in here that for a majority of people are scary to look into, but at the same time they're fascinating. You know, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
You know,
it's certainly very mysterious and certainly very visiting, as you say. You know, I think you mentioned earlier the first principles you get from visiting a place, you know, and the information you get from visiting a place that you just you wouldn't see in reality. You know, one of my favorite places just down the road in London, and it's been one of my favorite. It's a garden that is supposedly a Masonic garden. You know, and I love it. It's just down the road. And, and then you can go to another garden in Portugal, in Sintra, that's loaded with this sort of symbolism. It doesn't, you know, it's syncretic, and I wouldn't say it's indicative of some great some great Masonic sort of hierarchy, but it's just interesting to see how these symbols are used to create this bigger sort of game, really, you know, this kind of magical game, if you like. And it's certainly an adventure.
That's true. And then there's a famous saying, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. You know, and sometimes a garden's just a garden. But yes, there are symbols everywhere. I mean, you know, but it's interesting to and like I said, folks, I encourage you to pre-order the book and take a look for yourself, because again, you don't know where you're going unless you know where you've been, and I encourage you to just to kind of see a different side of history. There's some beautiful locations here. I mean, we're talking everything from Santorini, Greece, to, you know, Algeria in the desert, to different areas of Europe, and you've really you've pointed out the history of the occult through different beautiful areas of the world, and given us an education at the same time here, Andy. So it's really a very well put together book.
Thanks. We appreciate it. Yeah.
So, again, we have a link in the description of this program. Andy Sharp is our guest, and he is the author of the book. The book is the Astral Geographic, and it is available in October. Again, that's when the book will come out. The pre-order is available right now on Amazon. We have the link, as I said, in the description. The Astral Geographic, the Watkins Guide to the Occult World is the name of the book. Andy Sharp is our guest and the author. Go get it, or at least go pre-order it right now. Andy, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Pleasure. Thank you, too.
All right. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for listening this week. I want to thank Andy Sharp for being our guest today. I also want to thank Mally Fox for filling in for Bruiser this week. Again, keep your prayers, your thoughts, your good energy coming for Bruiser as he recovers from hip surgery. Again, that hip surgery is really, really painful. I don't know if you guys know how painful hip replacement surgery is, but Bruiser is doing well. Just to update you on how Bruiser is doing, he is doing well. He is recuperating. Bruiser 2.0 is rebuilding as we speak. We don't know when he'll be back, but he will be back shortly. So I don't have an ETA for when Bruiser will be back with us. But bear with us, folks, because Bruiser will be back shortly. Just, again, send your thoughts, your prayers, your good energy for Bruiser to continue healing from hip replacement surgery. And if you want to get a hold of him personally, you can check out the link in the description of this program and send your well wishes by social media. I know a lot of people get a hold of me and ask how he's doing. You can do it yourself by just going to his social media and sending your well wishes as well. Not that I don't mind sending it along, but you know, you can do it yourself. You can have that personal relationship with Bruiser should you wish. Folks, we're coming up on the weekend. I know we just had a holiday weekend, but we're coming up on the weekend, and a little reminder to do a little something nice for your neighbor or for someone who's maybe not able to do something themselves. Maybe they're disabled. Maybe they're just not able to do something for themselves. Do a little something for someone out there in the community who might be a little less fortunate this weekend. I know we took a lot of time for ourselves this weekend for the holiday weekend. We focused on ourselves. Now let's focus on someone a little less fortunate as we have a little extra nice weather this weekend. Get out there and enjoy it, but also get out there and help someone in need this weekend. A little message from your friends here at Darkness Radio. Be sure to take care of yourselves and each other. Get out there and enjoy the weekend a little as well this weekend. Go see a good movie this weekend. I know the movie business is down this week. The last couple of weeks, it seems like movies aren't making as much money this summer. Not like I need to be shilling for the movie business, but movie business is down lately. But there are some good movies out there. Indiana Jones is out there. I enjoyed Indy, so hopefully you'll go out there and go see a good movie this weekend. Got a good lineup of shows coming up in the next month. The month of July is packed full of good shows. True Crime Tuesday is going to be good this next month. Got some good shows coming up for Darkness Radio as well. I'm looking forward to bringing you some good shows this month. If you have a guest you'd like to hear, send it along, tim@darknessradio.com. By the way, if you have Parashare stories, tim@darknessradio.com, or if you want to send us a voice note, go to darknessradioshow.com, click on that blue button on the right-hand side of the website, and leave about a 2-minute note. You have 2 minutes to leave that voice note. If you need more time, then by all means, click on that blue button again, leave another 2 minutes. I'll stitch it together. We'll play it on the show, and we will listen to your lovely voice here on the air, and then we'll weigh in if you want us to weigh in. We always can use your Parashare stories here on Wednesdays, and we love to hear your Parashare stories here as part of Supernatural News. Have a great weekend, folks. We'll see you again next week for more in the best of true crime and supernatural programming right here on Darkness Radio.